In this video, we will be covering some of the strangest and darkest mysteries that range from an entire town that people seem to remember existing, but strangely has seemingly completely vanished from existence, to the strange case of Joan Ris, who went missing from her home in Massachusetts in the 1960s in some very strange and suspicious circumstances, to one of the most horrific and needlessly violent attacks and robberies that I've ever covered on this channel, in which several victims died and the case remains to this day completely unsolved. We will explore all of these and more, so grab a drink. My choice today is ginger beer, and there used to be ice in this glass, but it has since melted as it is very hot here in England at the moment. But yes, grab a drink and join me as we explore the Unsolved Mysteries iceberg. So Gary Sudbrink was in 1993 a 27-year-old captain of the Air Force who was at the time living in Texas, but was at the time in February of this year on his way to visit his family back in New York. And he kind of traveled there unannounced. He arrived, he spent the weekend there, and then on Monday decided to give one of his old friends, Mike, a call. And this was sort of a, let's catch up, let's grab a beer sort of call. But little did he know, this would be one of the first very strange calls that would take place over the next few months. So he called Mike, he told him, he was in town, he wanted to do some catching up, maybe hang out, grab a beer. And after telling him all this, Mike said to Gary that, dude, you just called me like a few days ago and said this exact same thing. And according to Mike, Gary called him a few days ago. He said that he had flown in to LaGuardia Airport and he kind of sounded a bit weird over the phone. He said that he had a cold or a flu or something, and so he couldn't hang out with Mike. And this was the first time that Gary had ever heard about this. Gary, or the real Gary, had never made that phone call, and whoever it was that did make the phone call seemed to be impersonating Gary. And so this led to obviously a few really big questions. And furthermore, Gary, the real Gary, had flown into the JFK airport, not the LaGuardia airport. And he said he didn't have a cold or a flu or anything like that. And then while Gary was in this call with Mike, his parents in the house received another phone call. And this phone call was arguably even stranger.
Yes, this is me. Can I speak to you? Can I ask why you're... Yes, can I ask why you're calling? Can I please ask... Yes, this is. Yes, that is me.
The voice sounded very, slow, very robotic, and some people say it sounds maybe either robotic or alien-like, or maybe demon-like. And Gary, it can be heard, seems to think that this is a prank call by his brother, Stephen. And I'll leave a link down below to unresolved.me, who have covered this case actually quite well. So take a look there if you want some more detail on the case, if you want to hear about the phone calls in full. But basically, over the next few days, the Sudbrinks repeatedly hear these phone calls, or rather they receive these phone calls, by this strange, slow, robotic, alien-like individual asking some very strange questions, like, is Gary Sudbrink there? Or is this Gary Sudbrink? As well as, how long are you going to be back from Texas? Which doesn't even make grammatical sense. And who is this? You're being impersonated by the other voice, which is kind of eerie and creepy. And throughout these phone calls, it then moves on to more, I guess, predictable alien stuff. Like keep an eye on the skies near Orion, as in Orion's belt. The full moon, show double from you, which this particular line has led some people to think that whoever was calling was like a double or a clone of Gary. Or that the person or being calling, making the phone call, was actually the real Gary who was disoriented, maybe in a daze, maybe in a trance, and the Gary that actually arrived at the house was the double. Which, if you like the idea of clones walking around and taking the place of real people, and also horror/thriller films, I do highly recommend the film Coherence, which is one of my favorite psychological thrillers of all time, and I think severely underrated. But anyway, eventually over more and more calls, while repeating more and more phrases, such as government interference, visitations to be disrupted by them, whoever them is, and some long ones such as we come, to be within this planet, to visit the many, to be contacted as the same with you, to eerily beware. And I'll be honest, this does sound like an alien trying to speak English. You know, someone who knows words, but has no idea their context or like how they kind of piece together. But after this last phone call, this was more or less all of these strange phone calls that the Sudbrinks received. But about a year before this, Gary's brother Stephen said he was driving down a highway in New York en route to a wedding. And he said he saw out of his car window, driving next to him on the highway, someone who looked kind of like Gary in a car that was also kind of like Gary's car. And Stephen said that this Gary person kind of made some weird hand gestures at Stephen and then just took off down the highway. And so, since Gary was also going to this wedding, Stephen just assumed that this was, you know, Gary driving the same way as him, kind of messing with him a little bit. But once he arrived at the wedding, he found that not only was Gary already there, he had been there for quite a while, but that he didn't even drive down to this wedding. He flew down from Texas and his car was still at home in Texas. So they never found out who this strange doppelgary was, but whether it was something to do with aliens and body snatchers and body doubles, or, you know, strange androids, government experiments, demons, perhaps, is always a possibility. Or whether it was a prank by Gary, you know, maybe he was actually in the car, but then he told Stephen, oh yeah, I actually flew down, so that couldn't have been me. Or whether it was a prank by Stephen and he didn't actually see anyone who looked like Gary. We don't really know, as there's no real way of knowing or telling. But Gary swore that he had absolutely nothing to do with this. You know, he wasn't pranking anyone, he wasn't in on anything. And he said that while he was flying over here, at the airport, some strange individuals like approached him with a clipboard, and they were asking him, you know, to answer questions, to answer surveys. And he said this was kind of pretty standard, he felt, but after he answered more and more and more, he started to get a bit like, all right, this is too many questions. And so he did end up saying, you know, I'm not going to answer any more, and then just leaving. But Gary felt that perhaps this maybe had something to do with it. And honestly, I don't really know what to think, but regardless, it is a very strange and creepy encounter and case. Gravitational interaction of antimatter is one heck of a complicated case, so I won't get too deep into it. But antimatter is basically matter, only anti, as in it's negatively charged. And so a single particle of anti-hydrogen is the same makeup and mass as hydrogen, only it's charged in the opposite direction. And what this means is that when matter and antimatter combine, so you know you have one hydrogen particle, one anti-hydrogen, when they come together and touch each other, it results in a kind of tiny explosion or relatively large explosion depending on how much matter you have, and results in the destruction of both of these particles. And if you like fun facts, bananas actually release small amounts of antimatter because due to their radioactive decay, which is like ever so slight, ever so subtle, they do actually release positrons, which are the antimatter version of electrons. So yeah. But this case basically just covers the mystery of how antimatter reacts and interacts with gravity, because at the time it was kind of hard to measure. Some people thought that it would react normally, as in gravity would pull antimatter towards it. And some people thought because it is antimatter that it would act anti to regular matter, so that gravity would actually push antimatter away. And I don't know why this is in the mystery iceberg, because it doesn't seem to be a mystery any longer. There were experiments done in 2023 where they took anti-hydrogen particles, held it in a magnetic field, and then they slowly turned off this magnetic field, gradually kind of exposing it to gravity. And what they found was this antimatter just acted like regular matter. It slowly fell down to Earth, just as you would expect from regular hydrogen. And even though this mystery is solved, antimatter itself is still incredibly interesting, incredibly mysterious, and there are still a lot of mysteries regarding it, like, for example, why there is so little antimatter in the universe, you know, compared to regular matter, as it is thought at the start of the universe that these two things were equal. So there was the same amount of matter as there was antimatter. And so if every time antimatter touches regular matter, they both kind of, you know, explode and disappear, then surely the ratio should still be the same and you shouldn't have this completely lopsided ratio. And this problem is known as the baryon asymmetry problem, but that is another mystery for another time. The Hans Buckman UFO abduction. Now, the case of Hans Buckman is a very interesting one indeed, and this was potentially the first ever recorded alien abduction in history. This was all the way back in 1572, so a long time ago, when in the small farming village of Crispul in Switzerland, a man named Hans Buckman owed the equivalent of a few £100s to a local business. And he had been over time kind of borrowing more and more and then paying it off kind of in little bits here and there. But he was a farmer, and this recent harvest that he had was apparently so good that he decided to just take a bunch of the money from it and pay off his debt entirely. So he decided to one day go to this business, which was a tavern in the next town over. He woke up, he gathered a bunch of his cash, he didn't tell his family for whatever reason, and he set off on that morning with, you know, his cape, his hood, his little walking stick, and he was going to this next town to pay off his debt. It was only a 2-hour walk away, but when he finally arrived there, he found that the tavern owner wasn't there. And so he said, you know, okay, while I'm waiting for the tavern owner to get here, I guess the most logical, sensible thing would be to head over to another tavern and pass the time while having a drink, or 5 or 10, and from here he didn't really remember much. He then woke up in a strange town, or rather a strange city, with most of his clothes gone. He was just wearing like, you know, raggedy old bits and bobs. His walking stick was missing, his gloves were missing, his overcoat was missing, and so he was just absolutely startled by this when he woke up. He ran out from where he was onto the main street, just screaming in German, you know, where am I? Or where am I? I think he sounded exactly like that. You know, he was screaming like, what year is it? All of this crazy stuff. Everyone there just ignored him until finally he ran up to a soldier and started asking him these same questions. And he told the soldier, my name is Hans Buckman and I was traveling to my native city of Sempak, but I seem to have lost my way. And then he asked the soldier what city he was currently in, and the soldier replied, this is Milan, and you are a long way from Sempak, which honestly just sounds like a line out of a movie or something. But Hans had ended up here in Milan, 150 miles away. He had lost most of his possessions and clothes. He had been missing for more than 2 weeks, and over time he seemed to get more and more of his memory back from, you know, the last 2 weeks. And he said, yeah, I do remember having a drink, or, you know, 2 or 5 or 10. And then he said he was making his way back home. You know, he had his drinks, he left the tavern, he was heading home, and he said he would just come back into town another day when the man was likely here. But then suddenly, while he was on his way home, he heard this strange noise, like buzzing, almost like bees, he said. And then he saw a bright light, and then he was lifted up above the tree line, and that is all he remembers for the next 2 weeks. And so after this encounter, after he woke up, he then made his way all the way back home, and after a week of hiking after arriving home, he found that his sons had already left the home. They had gone out looking for him, and on the path between their home and the local town, the sons had apparently found like most of his belongings. They found his overcoat, they found his gloves and his walking stick, and that was basically the entire story. Now bear in mind, this was in the 1500s, not like the 1950s or the 1920s or something, but almost 500 years ago, long before the founding even of the United States, or even before the landing on the United States, you know, by Europeans. But yeah, it's a very interesting case. Let me know what you think about this one down below. Was it actually the first ever recorded alien abduction? Was it perhaps something to do with time travel or something else supernatural? Or was this Hans Buckman having maybe a little few too many drinks and then going on a mad 2-week bender, spending all of his money, and then when he ran out of money in Milan, making something up to be like, oh yeah, I was taken up into the trees, and that's where all my money went. Sorry, can't pay you for another while. Or was he just making up that he had the money? You know, maybe he didn't actually have the money for the debt. He made up this entire story, maybe tried to skip town, and then when he found that he couldn't live on his own, he couldn't make it in Milan, then made up this whole story, this whole backstory. I will let you decide on that one, but definitely let me know down below. Hermes Trismeus. So the mystery here, as far as I can tell, isn't just one individual mystery, you know, a mystery that needs to be solved, but rather it's a whole entry, a whole topic, and I know that doesn't make much sense at the moment, but it will in just a few minutes. And Hermes Trismeus was the name for a divine figure that seemed to pop up in the common and spiritual discourse sometime around between like the hundreds BC to around 200 AD, that sort of date range. And this figure, as the name kind of suggests, is kind of a combination, kind of like a fusion of the Greek god Hermes, you know, the Greek messenger god, and the Egyptian god who we covered in the ancient artifacts iceberg, that being Thoth, or Tot, or Thot, or To. There really are a bunch of different pronunciations for this god, and we're not sure which one is actually correct, so you cannot have a go at me for mispronouncing it. But it kind of made sense that these two gods would be fused in a way, like they were from similar eras, you know, they were around about at the same time, both of the nations that believed in them, you know, Greece and Egypt. They were quite heavily connected through migration, through leadership and rulership, with obviously various leaders in Egypt, like famously Cleopatra, being essentially Greek, essentially Hellenistic. They often had a lot of crossovers with their languages, you know, from Egyptian to ancient Greek, and so it would make sense that these two similar-ish gods might slowly be merged into one entity over the years. They were both basically gods of knowledge, and in some forms gods of writing, you know, messenger gods, and this was of scripture, of travelers, of information or knowledge. And so this figure, Hermes Trismeus, over the years developed, who was kind of a mixture of both of these gods. And partly how we know about this god is from all of the works that they produced, you know, written scripts, transcripts, documents, etc., all signed off by Hermes Trismeus. Now, we're almost certain that almost all of these books, if not actually all of them, weren't actually written, you know, with a pen by this Hermes god, or specifically Hermes Trismeus. I don't want to get it confused with actual Hermes. But like Thoth, these scripts were simply signed off with this name, as this was at the time simply a common attribution. You know, a lot of the scribes kind of worshipped these script and information and knowledge gods. And so any knowledge that they had as scribes, any skills that they had in writing, it was all, you know, essentially blessed based and originating from these messenger gods. And so I think it's similar in ways to, you know, how like an athlete might thank God for their victory. You know, they're not saying God actually came down and with his God foot kick the ball into the goal, but they're saying that with the inspiration of God, with the dedication to God, etc., that God was essentially responsible for their victory. And this is how a lot of scribes at the time saw their connection with Hermes Trismegistus. And so when they were making a document, when they were making a script or a manuscript, they would often sign it off Hermes Trismegistus, kind of thanking this god for their knowledge and wisdom. And so that resulted in so many of these scripts, so many of these documents being signed off in this way. And so it is thought that over 1,300 authors over the years attributed their work to this Hermes Trismegistus. And so just like we have the Book of Thoth, all pieces of work and documents and scripts, etc., that are signed off as Hermes Trismegistus are organized and categorized into something called the Hermes Corpus, with a notable example being the Emerald Tablet, which we covered in the Ancient Artifacts Iceberg. Now, that is kind of part one of the mystery, you know, who Hermes Trismegistus really was, with it likely being over, as I said, 1,000 different authors, but who these authors were, we really have no idea. But as you can imagine, with all of these pieces of work, with all of these scripts and documents being written and, you know, signed off by Hermes Trismegistus, it started to build quite a substantial body of work. And this entire work, this entire collection and body of knowledge basically came to be studied at the time as something called Hermeticism, which was the belief or essentially study in works of Hermes Trismegistus. And this was, you know, this Hermeticism was thought to be kind of like a secret society sort of thing, where they would keep and organize all of the best, most important documents. You know, they would use it all for their own benefit, and they would kind of be like the Illuminati, you know, which just means kind of illuminated ones. And so with all of this knowledge and information they had, the Hermetics were basically illuminated themselves. And it was slowly, secretly accumulating all of this knowledge, you know, knowledge of the divine, of the gods, but also stuff to do with, you know, scientific sort of things. And it is thought that Hermeticism basically was, you know, the founding idea in modern science, because you had all of this knowledge, all of this, you know, information about physics, about alchemy, which evolved into chemistry, about botany and stuff, which eventually evolved into, you know, biology and medicine. And it is thought that by collecting all of these together and with some great minds working on these ideas, that this basically led to the evolution of science as we know it today. And whether that's true or not, I'm not entirely sure. It is a very cool concept though. And as I promised, this is not like a definitive mystery, you know, like who shot the sheriff, but rather it is more a mysterious topic, a very fascinating and interesting topic. And yeah, just not one I think we'll get a direct answer to necessarily anytime soon. Herxheim is an archaeological site in Germany that had some fascinating and questionable discoveries. And these discoveries were from between like 6,500 and 8,000 years ago, which was during the Stone Age. And when all this stuff was dug up in 1996, they discovered these huge pits, basically these mass graves containing more than 1,000 skeletons. And these were people who were attacked, who were beaten, some were burnt, some were thought to have been like, you know, sacrificed, and a lot of them were thought to have been eaten. And most of the individuals in these graves tended to be from like the local area, but a fair few of them were from these really, really far away lands, which has led to kind of a lot of confusion as to why these people were here, what they were doing here, how they got here, and how they died. So firstly, a lot of the wounds, a lot of the specifically blows to these people's heads tended to be in similar fashions in kind of the same area, the same part of the head, which led people to believe that these were ritualistic, cannibalistic killings. So instead of the attacks, instead of the wounds being, you know, dealt in battle or dealt a little more randomly over the body, it seemed to have been something like, yep, come up, lie on this rock or something, and then they were killed in the same fashion, and then they were eaten. And we know that a lot of them were eaten because of a bunch of human teeth marks on a lot of the bones, as well as a lot of the bones and skulls, etc., shown evidence of being skinned. And this was either before or after they were killed, which makes it a little more terrifying. And there were certain body parts that weren't found at the site in the numbers that you would expect to find them. So for example, the spinal column, the patella, the ilium, and sternum notably were found in much lower numbers than all other body parts, meaning that likely these body parts were, you know, taken away, they were consumed by whoever did these killings. So it's a wild, terrifying find, I think. The skeletons range from adults to children, and as I said, range from both local people to people from quite distant lands. And so whether this was, you know, a sudden case of like invasion, where a bunch of people came over into these people's lands, and then they ended up killing them and cannibalizing them, or whether this was a more gradual migration, which also ended up in killing and cannibalizing, we are not entirely sure. But regardless, it is still a pretty dark and I would say terrifying mystery. The Hornet Spook light is basically a floating light in the sky seen around Oklahoma since the 1800s. The reports of this light range from like yay big or yay big to like yayer big, and some people say that it floats around the treetops, others say that it kind of just zips around the sky, and still others say that it kind of just swings or sways in the air, kind of like someone holding a lantern perhaps. So yeah, not too deep of a mystery, but it is there nonetheless. The Jimmy Carter UFO incident. And we did actually cover this one, as well as many other cases in the alien iceberg. So go check that out if you like this sort of stuff. It is 8 hours of non-stop alien content. But at the time, in 1969, 8 years before Jimmy Carter would become president, he was, at the time, the governor of Georgia. And one evening, he reported seeing a UFO. He said he was outside at the time with like 10 or so people, and he said there was this bright light in the sky that appeared to grow in size, to get closer and closer to him, all while slowly changing colors from white to blue to red, you know, a true American UFO. Before it, you know, got closer to him and then just changed directions and zipped off into the sky, never to be seen again. And as I said, Jimmy wasn't alone in this encounter. There were at least 10 other people that said that they saw this light, and it wasn't thought that Jimmy was, you know, making this up for any reason. He wasn't normally the sort to be into UFOs or to be, you know, fanatical about them. So for him to just make this up out of the blue, along with these many other witnesses, was considered to be a bit inconceivable. And it should be noted that he never actually claimed that this was a UFO. I mean, he did say it was a flying object that was unidentified, so I guess he did say that it was a UFO, but he never actually claimed that it was alien. But he said that whatever it was, it definitely wasn't a helicopter or a weather balloon, as he was quite familiar with those, and he said, yeah, it definitely wasn't that, but as to what it actually was, I kind of have no idea. He also said that after becoming president, he wasn't made aware or he didn't find out any information about this. You know, he said he looked into it maybe a little bit, but he didn't see any government conspiracies regarding it or secret government flights in that area at that time. And so yeah, bit of a strange one. As I said, if you like alien sort of stuff, then definitely go check out the alien iceberg. Joan Ris. And my god, why does every single mystery, every bloody mystery have to be from this state, Massachusetts. But Joan Ris was a lady living in Massachusetts at the time, and she was born in New York. She graduated college with an English literature degree, and then went on to work as an editorial assistant at the Thomas Y. Cromwell Company. And it was here that she would meet and later marry, a few years later, one of the executives from the company, Martin Ris. So the couple married in 1956. Joan left work to start a family with Martin, and the couple ended up having 2 kids. And it was on this day, 24th of October 1961, that things started off seemingly completely fine, but ended up a bit dark and out of the ordinary. And so the day started fairly normally. Martin got up, went to work. Joan took her daughter Lillian to the dentist, and that all went fine. She got back, she started doing some, housework around the house, and then she dropped Lillian off at a neighbor's house while her son was apparently taking a nap. And she told the neighbor basically, look after Lillian for a little bit. I'm just running some errands. I'll be back in a short while. And after about 10 or 15 minutes, the kid who lived next door said he saw Joan in kind of like a trench coat, seemingly carrying something red, and walking down the driveway and out of the house. And this was the last confirmed sighting of Joan. Now, there were kind of a few dubious, a few strange, a few like maybe sightings of her that were either her getting into a car or her, walking around different parts of town on highways out of town. And these all seem to be someone matching Joan's description, but looking and acting kind of dazed, kind of disorientated. But none of these sightings could be officially confirmed. And she was eventually discovered missing. When Joan's daughter Lillian, the one that Joan dropped off at the neighbor, she eventually went back home and then was there for, a few minutes, and then went back to the neighbor and told them that Mummy is gone and the kitchen is covered in red paint, which is somewhat disconcerting. The neighbor herself then went over to the house, found Joan missing, found Joan's 2-year-old son crying in his crib, and found blood, not red paint, all around the kitchen. So she then called the police and an investigation was soon started. So police obviously started the investigation straight away. They came into the house and, as I said, they found blood all around the kitchen. But as well as blood, the kitchen and the rest of the house was just kind of in pure chaos. There was a roll of drawing paper just kind of rolled, thrown across the ground. The family's trash can was taken out from where it normally is. It was in the middle of the floor in the kitchen. And the blood, which was mostly just in the kitchen, was also leading from the kitchen to the stairs, to the top of the stairs, then to the master bedroom, then back down again, and then out to the garage. The blood was also in their kid's bedroom, as well as on the car in the garage. And all of this blood was tested and was confirmed to be the same type as Joan's blood. So it's a very strange and odd picture. It should also be noted that there was only around an estimated 250 ml of blood, so the amount of blood that was on the scene at the scene wasn't thought to be life-threatening, but it seems like what maybe happened was that Joan was, attending to things around the house. She either accidentally or on purposefully cut herself, and then as she was bleeding, maybe trying to stop the bleeding, running around, she made her way all around the house, kind of bleeding everywhere, and then for some reason left the house and then went somewhere. Like, that seems to be only half the story, half the plot. And one theory for this was that she did this accidentally, she injured herself, and then instead of, calling for help, maybe she tried to go into town to try and get bandages or something, and then because of the blood loss ended up becoming disorientated and either getting lost or further injured somewhere else. Which this doesn't seem to me like a, likely theory. Like, for her to leave her family and her daughter with her neighbors and her 2-year-old crying in his cot instead of, just going to the neighbors and asking them for help. So I don't think too highly of that theory. And she also didn't take her family car, which is a bit bit strange if, you're injured and you want to get somewhere quickly. Or another theory is that Joan injured herself on purpose. She made this kind of scene. She didn't injure herself too badly because, as I said, the amount of blood she lost in the house likely wasn't life-threatening, but it was just enough to kind of make things messy, smear stuff everywhere. And then she left the house. She ran away, leaving this kind of scene behind, this blood trail, as maybe some sort of evidence, she thought, of her being attacked or kidnapped. And those were just some theories about what might have actually happened on that day. But when the father, Martin Ris, was notified about Joan's disappearance, he immediately rushed back to the house. And when he kind of came into the kitchen, when he started looking around the house, trying to see if anything was off or unusual, he noted a few things in the family trash can. One was a bottle of liquor, which Martin says, okay, that's not that strange. We drank last night. We ended up finishing the bottle. That's all completely normal. But also in the trash can were these 4 bottles of beer, which Martin said he had never seen before. He said he and Joan didn't drink them. They had no reason to be in there, and they weren't there the previous night. So that just brings up more questions. Did Joan herself drink these? Was she, kind of spiraling out of control, spinning out, ended up having some day drinks and then deciding to do this? Or was she actually kidnapped somehow and these beers were drank by her kidnappers? As I said, there were a lot of questions surrounding this case, and while the search was underway, there was a particular journalist who was basically investigating this, basically covering the case, and this journalist decided to basically brush up on this sort of thing, on this sort of disappearance, on this sort of crime. And so she went to the local library in order to take out some similar books on some similar cases. And while she was doing this, while she was taking out these books, she realized that Joan herself had actually signed out these books, or at least a few of them, earlier that year, with as many as 25 similar books being taken out by Joan in the summer of 1961. And these were all books, either fiction or non-fiction, on disappearances, on murders, on kidnappings, on staged disappearances, with one of the books, Into Thin Air, being about a woman who left blood smears at the scene and a bloody towel before disappearing and basically faking this crime, which sounds a little similar to maybe what happened in this case. And so I think I kind of lean towards it being an inside job, of Joan setting this up for whatever reason, not wanting to stay with her family, and then, faking the attack, faking the kidnapping, and running away, essentially. But there are a lot of theories, a lot of different angles to this case, so let me know your thoughts on it down below. The Hexsburg UFO incident occurred in 1965 when residents of a bunch of states in the US and a bunch of cities in Canada, like this whole general area roughly, saw and reported what they described as a fireball traveling through the sky, coming down at a steep angle, which a lot of people since then and at the time proposed might have been an alien craft. And at the time, in this little village of Hexsburg, Pennsylvania, locals reported this small object with blue smoke crash landing into the nearby woods. And soon it was called in, state police and even the army cordoned off the entire area, and they started an investigation in this area, even bringing in US Army engineers and scientists, which begs the question, what the hell landed there that night? The official records say that they basically found nothing there in the woods that night, which is exactly what a cover-up might say, but theories range from it being a strange alien craft to, a Soviet or American satellite falling to Earth, to it being something maybe a little more natural, like a very bright meteor bolide. The Kensington Rune stone is this strange-looking sandstone tablet covered in the strange-looking runes or glyphs that was found in 1898 in Minnesota. And it was found by a man named Olaf Ullman, who was recently an immigrant from Sweden. And he said that he was just, out on his land plowing some trees, and he found this runestone down in the ground. He said he was digging up a tree, you know, removing a tree, and tangled up in the roots of this tree was this runestone, and on the runestone itself were these ancient carvings, apparently dating back to the year 1362. Now, a find like this normally would be, you know, quite fantastic. You find anything in the ground that's like 700 years old, it's gonna be pretty amazing. But this particular find was really quite interesting because it painted a picture of Nordic explorers in an area of America that they were previously thought to have not explored. I think it's quite well known that Nordic explorers did explore North America, you know, before the Europeans or before the Southern Europeans. So before, obviously, America was founded, or the United States of America was founded, and even before Christopher Columbus explored various parts of America, the Nordic people explored obviously Greenland, which is part of North America, strangely, but also they explored little areas in like northern Canada, Newfoundland sort of area, and this was, as I said, long before the Southern Europeans ever arrived onto the continent. But it is thought that they didn't really travel much further than this, so they didn't go as far as, you know, like New York or Carolina or Florida or anything, and so this runestone being found from the 1300s in Minnesota was a very strange, unusual, peculiar item to say the least. And the runestone read, word for word, and obviously translated into English, 8 Gotalanders and 22 Northmen on this exploration journey from Vinland far to the west. We had a camp by 2 shelters, 1 day's journey north from this stone. We were fishing one day. After we came home, found 10 men red from blood and dead. Ave or Ave Maria, save from evil. There are 10 men by the inland sea to look after our ships. 14 days journey from this peninsula. Year 1362. And for the most part, as far as I can tell, this stone is kind of largely considered a hoax. And there are a few reasons for that. One is that the runes used on this runestone are runes that wouldn't have been necessarily popular in the 1300s, and some of which wouldn't have even been invented in the 1300s. The grammar and structure of the text is all a little weird and a little modern, with it being said that it is actually closer to modern day Swedish than to this ancient kind of rune Swedish. And it was a little suspicious because it was found by a Swedish immigrant, which, I mean, like, what are the odds of that? Surely someone else would have found this, not, you know, particularly a Swedish immigrant. And the particular era that this runestone was found in was a time where, you know, talks of Nordic exploration, of Vikings conquering different lands, sailing the seas, this is all becoming, you know, more and more popular. And so again, what a coincidence that at this particular time, this runestone was found. And to add to that, the tree roots that this runestone was found in were apparently like no older than 40 years old, which I know doesn't completely disprove this theory, as it could have been, you know, in the mud and then the tree roots could have grown around it. But it's just one more thing in this, you know, checklist of it being a little bit dubious, a little bit maybe probably of a hoax. And yeah, that is more or less it for the Kensington runestone. But I just want to quickly mention that this kind of idea, this theory of Nordic people traveling further south than we think they did, is a super interesting topic to kind of dive into. And you should definitely check it out if you like this sort of thing. But there are some theories of these Nordic explorers going as far south as Florida, and even as far south as Mexico, with some Mayan and Aztec artwork seemingly depicting some white people, you know, with blonde hair, with blue eyes, white skin, being captured and killed long before Columbus and his people ever arrived there. On top of that, there are also some Central American myths and legends of the local people having trapped and killed some red-headed giants, with obviously red hair originating from the Vikings. And if they're a little taller, maybe 6 feet tall, and you're a Central or South American, you're maybe 4 feet tall or something, maybe 4.5 feet, these people could very well be considered giants. So yeah, really cool, I think, theories and myths and legends behind that idea. But as for the Kensington runestone being real, I think most likely probably not, but it is still a very fun entry nonetheless. Kevin J. Ayotte was a young boy aged 3 who went missing from his home in Minnesota in 1982. And I think the strangest thing that strikes me about this case is the seeming complete lack of evidence or a trail or any clues about it. Like, it's very strange. This was on a day in September in 1982 where just before around kind of 5 p.m. Kevin, 3 years old, and his brother Terry, who was 9 years old, were both upstairs in their family home in the Sugar Bush Township, which was a small town with a population of around 120 people. Their mum, Joan Ayotte, stepped outside briefly for just a few minutes. She said she was washing some of the outside windows, and when she came back in, Terry asked her if she had seen Kevin. She said no, she hadn't seen Kevin, and so both her and Terry kind of walked around, looked for Kevin. They looked inside the house, they looked inside the rooms, and they looked out back, but there was absolutely no sign of Kevin or of his 6-month-old puppy, Flash. And bear in mind that this property, this area, was kind of like in the middle of nowhere. I mean, honestly, just look at it. So, after looking for him for a short while, Joanne ended up calling the police, and soon a search was started. And they got everyone from friends, family, local police, firefighters, and they searched the entire house, the entire property, you know, out front on the street, out back in all of these fields and forests and woods. But one of the problems was that this was in the middle of nowhere, as I said, and the surrounding area was just absolutely huge, with the local sheriff actually repeatedly telling the press that, you know, look, we have everyone out here looking. We're doing crazy hours trying to find this kid, but the area that we need to search is just absolutely massive. You know, there were forests, fields, bogs, swamps, lakes, and as the hours passed on this search, no clues came in, no trails came in, and the sheriff was apparently quite, you know, straightforward this whole time. He was saying, look, you know, it's been 2 days, the temperatures are near freezing, and it wouldn't even take 2 days for a normal, you know, a grown-up to die in this weather. So he said it didn't really look that good for a 3-year-old, especially one without proper clothes, proper shelter, and who was both non-verbal and had trouble hearing, which it was a mystery, you know, in and of itself where Kevin actually was, but it was also a mystery why he left the house in the first place. Did he leave of his own accord, you know, wanting to just get out of the house, explore, take his dog with him, and then ended up getting lost? Or was he perhaps kidnapped? Did someone else enter the home? Or did Kevin not leave of his own accord? And perhaps this whole thing was maybe being covered up. As I said, the search was kind of, at least initially, a failure. There was no trail that had been found, no footprints, no evidence, no sightings, no scent, until 6 days after the initial search was started, Flash, the 6-month-old puppy, ended up actually making his way back to the house. But sadly, he was alone, and so they still didn't know where Kevin was. And as you can imagine, with no other clues, with no other, you know, trail or evidence, this was seen kind of as like a major breakthrough. And so they tried to use this dog to try and find some more clues. They tried to see which direction he came from, to see, you know, where Kevin might be. They ended up pumping the dog's stomach to see what kind of foods he had maybe eaten over the last 6 days, but that kind of turned up nothing. It seemed like he had just eaten, you know, grass and stuff, which was absolutely all over the area. Then they fitted a GPS collar onto Flash and, you know, drove him out, kind of dropped him off in different areas to see where he would go. Maybe he would go back to Kevin, but every single time he just ended up coming back home. The case itself was marked as an abduction case, and the search carried on for a while. Kevin's face was eventually put onto milk cartons, but sadly, through all of this, no further substantial clues or trails were ever found, and Kevin to this day remains a missing person. The Kegali Ripper was an uncaught serial killer in Rwanda, Africa in 2012, and it was really a brutal set of affairs, and it started in July when police found these 3 strangled adult workers who were killed in Rwanda's capital in Kigali. And they weren't found, you know, all 3 together, but rather they were separate cases found over the month of July in Kigali. And this, at the time, was like somewhat normal. You know, like, not that murder is ever normal, but sadly, as we know on this channel, adult workers tend to be targeted more than normal people. And so 3 killings in the capital city, all, you know, within a month. Maybe they're connected, maybe they're not. And so no one really suspected a serial killer at this point in time. And then came August, where they found more and more adult workers having been killed. And they were all killed in Kegali, all having been strangled to death. And by the time August was over, they had counted 12 victims, 12 adult workers, all strangled to death in Kegali just in August alone. And as I said, all of them were strangled to death, but some even had their eyes gouged out and were mutilated in various ways. And part of these killings were 3 women, all killed, all strangled to death on the same day, in the middle of the day, with one of them not being even an adult worker, but she is thought to have witnessed one of the killings, and so she herself was killed in order to cover it up. Then, the very next day, a woman named Clementine Uwinbabazi was found killed in her home with a message that read, "I will stop once I've killed 400 adult workers," carved into her chest and stomach. So yeah, some pretty insane and gruesome stuff. Police ended up arresting and then eventually releasing 2 men, and they were released mainly due to like lack of evidence, really. And while these 2 men were arrested, these killings simply continued, which I guess was kind of proof to the police and officials that these weren't the men that they were looking for. Then in November, police said that they had arrested 8 men, 8 suspects, and that one of these suspects had actually confessed to these crimes, and there would be a trial taking place soon after. But then news about this case kind of slowed down, communication kind of stopped between, the police and the press. This trial actually ended up never taking place, with the confession eventually having thought to either never happened or to have been, forced out of this suspect, and so it was maybe later recanted. The police eventually released all 8 of the men that they had originally, arrested, and so it seemed like they were kind of just back to square one. Then the next year there were 2 more reports of these murders, and then the year after that there was only 1 more, and so it seemed that whoever was doing this, at least originally, had either stopped or slowed down for whatever reason, and they weren't following through with their promise of killing 400 adult workers. One theory by police officials at the time said that because more than 50% of adult workers in Rwanda are HIV positive, that perhaps someone went to a, adult worker, they caught HIV from one of them, and then decided to, get revenge, go on a killing spree, and that was the reason for this series of attacks, which I would say is probably quite plausible as a theory. And while doing research into this case, I found a very, very interesting article, insight, write-up into how a lot of the countries in Africa don't really have a dedicated serial killer database or anything like that. Like, for example, you have in America with the FBI. And so in terms of serial killer trackers or profilers or a dedicated team, a lot of those countries simply lack this, which leads to predictably a lot of these cases being, dead ends, being stalled or unsolved, which leads to unsolved killing sprees like this one. Kissa Jensen was a 14-year-old girl who lived in the city of Napier in New Zealand when she was out one afternoon riding her horse, and she never returned home. And so this was one September afternoon in 1983 when at around 3 p.m. Kissa left the house. She took her horse Commodore and she was going to the beach just for a ride on her horse, enjoying the afternoon weather. And the events aren't super clear as to what happened that day, but there were several witnesses that said that they saw Kissa throughout the day or throughout the afternoon. A few said they saw her on the horse, a few said they saw her at this World War II emplacement, and at this point she was off the horse, she had her horse with her, and she had a bloody face. One of these witnesses spoke to her and she said she had basically fallen off the horse, that's why she was bleeding from the face, and she was waiting there for her parents. Other witnesses said they saw her around this time talking to an old white guy in a truck, and then another witness said that they saw a white truck driving around the area. You know, it was driving over a bridge that was nearby, and in this white truck there was a guy driving the truck, and he apparently had his arm around a girl sitting in the passenger side. And all of this witness testimony obviously came after, you know, during the investigation, but at the time, as I said, Kissa left the house at around 3 p.m, and when she didn't return by 5:30, her parents started to get worried and they reported her missing. So a search was almost immediately started. The police found her horse Commodore, who was tied up near the World War II emplacement, but there was no sign of Kissa. They searched the local area, the local fields, the rivers, still no sign of her, and that was kind of as far as the investigation went. They did end up arresting a man named Joan Russell, who had a questionable background. He had previous convictions of assault, shall we say, on women, and he seemed to vaguely at least match the description that some of the witnesses gave. So as I said, they arrested him, they searched his house, they searched his truck, but nothing really turned up. And he did apparently confess to this murder, but then later retracted it. So they were never actually able to use this confession, and he was never charged for this crime. And then later he did, you know, himself in 1992, but left no confession at the time, left no explanation or reason as to why he did it. So we're not entirely sure on that one. Then in 1999, a man from Melbourne confessed to this murder, but there was zero evidence for it. It didn't really go anywhere. And in 2009, the officer in charge of this case said that there was more evidence for John Russell not being the killer. You know, John Russell being the original guy who was arrested. He said there's more evidence for John Russell not being the killer than of him actually being the killer. So honestly, I don't really know what to believe. Her body was never found, no further evidence was ever found for this case, and so sadly, to this day, this case does remain unsolved. The Kosovo student poisoning was an attack that occurred in 1990, when over the course of a few months, over 8,000 students in schools across Kosovo, this country here, were poisoned by unknown means and at least officially for unknown reasons. And this all started in March of 1990, when first 1, then 2, then 5, then 10, 20, 50, 100, more and more students across multiple schools in Kosovo started to come down with a terrible illness. Their eyes would swell up, they would get nausea and dizziness, you know, foaming at the mouth, body cramps, and even fainting. It was really quite bad. And the cause for this was traced to maybe something like poison gas, or to this strange white powder found around some of the schools. You know, like some students came into school, found, you know, dusted on their desk this strange white powder, and then when they interacted with it, when they brushed it away or something, they would end up inhaling a little bit, and then this would cause them to, you know, suffer some symptoms. Luckily, very few, if any, students died from this attack, and even though no one was officially caught or like charged, to understand the, I think, highly probable cause for this attack, you know, the motivation behind it, we need to go back a few months before this event and just quickly explore the history of Kosovo. So Kosovo, as you can tell from this map, has this little jaggedy line on the Serbian part of its border, and this is because Kosovo used to be part of Serbia, but became its own country when it declared independence in 2008. And what was basically happening around this time was that Kosovo was a region, part of Serbia, but this region had mostly Albanian Muslim citizens. And Serbia generally didn't like this because they were overwhelmingly Christian, around like 80 to 90%. And so there was this big kind of fight started, you know, with officials, with the government, even with the military and, you know, citizens themselves, all basically wanting to kick the Serbian Muslims back over the border to Albania, you know, which was majoritively Muslim, and keep Serbia fully Christian. And obviously the Serbian Muslims who were in Kosovo, they were kind of living there. They didn't just want to leave their homes. And so this was basically the cause for this big clash. And so a few months before this attack, Serbia basically released a law saying that in these schools, the children would basically be segregated. They said that the ethnically Serbian students would attend the school in the morning, and then they would leave, and the ethnically Albanian students would attend it in the afternoon. And then these attacks happened. And as you can see from this map, this is kind of where the attacks grew over time. So it is thought that this was the root of, whoever was planting this substance or attacking these students. This is the general kind of route they took. And if I overlay it with a map of the demographics, you can see that the areas with like the highest concentrations of Albanians are more or less the areas that got attacked, and the areas who are majoritively Serbian more or less missed. So it seems like, at least to me, that this attack was focused on the Albanians, and it was done by the Serbians attacking Albanian students in these schools, either in an attempt to like actually, kill them or injure them, or as a scare tactic in order to say like, look, you're not safe here. You may as well just take you and your family and your kids, go back to Albania. And I think it is a pretty dark and horrific attack. The authorities in Kosovo, when, all the students started to fall ill, they basically requested to Serbia saying like, look, all of our students are suddenly falling ill. Some of them are in real danger. Are you able to send over medical supplies? Can we use some of your hospitals? Can you give us any help? And Serbia basically said, you're making it all up. Maybe your students just have like the flu or something. Just go home, get some rest. But you're not allowed into Serbia, and we won't send you any help. So yeah, pretty dark and brutal, especially when you're talking about students. Thankfully, as I said, nobody was killed in these attacks. But as for actually who perpetrated them, we still to this day have no idea. Letitia Tarot was a 29-year-old woman found stabbed to death in 1937 in an underground train carriage in Paris in some very strange and almost like movie-like circumstances. And that was because Letitia got onto this train carriage, which was seemingly an empty carriage as far as anyone could tell. And then 60 seconds later, at the next stop, she was found dead on the train with no one entering or leaving the carriage. So that begged the question, who killed Letitia? And why? And how? And what? And so obviously investigators started to dig into the life of Letitia, started to investigate her, and they found that she was originally from Italy. She moved to Paris, and when she was in Paris, she started to work these fairly regular jobs. And at the time of her death, she was working 2 official jobs, one in a factory 12 hours a day, 5 to 6 days a week, and the other in a nightclub 3 nights a week. So she was a busy woman. But on top of that, she was also employed by a man named George Rufiniak, and George ran a private detective agency. And in her job here, she was typically tasked with, a bit of minor spy work, investigating spouses, finding out where people were going, like in the middle of the day, like not super heavy spy stuff, just some minor investigations. But that is just kind of the tip of the iceberg of the jobs and roles that Letitia had. So during her time in the nightclub, she was also thought to be kind of like a double agent, working in the nightclub in the cloakroom and then reporting on any famous people that came in, any popular or important people, tracking what they did in the nightclub, who they did it with, just that sort of thing. Then she was also a member of a liberal anti-fascist group, and this was called La Ligue Républicaine, as well as she was a member of a far-right violent political group, that being La Cagoule. So, like, what the hell? She had ties to France, to Italy. She had 3 jobs, at least 3 jobs, and was a member of both a far-left anti-fascist political group as well as a far-right violent revolutionary group. And so, as you can imagine, around this time in the 1930s, this was obviously in the lead up to World War II, and so you had many groups that promoted, political activism, extremism, stuff was bubbling up all over Europe, and this far-right party that Letitia was a member of, it kind of had a history of bombings, of political and violent attacks, of corruptions, murders, and their aim as a group was basically to cause chaos and to eventually overthrow the liberal leadership in France, and then to take over as fascists in France and to team up with Germany and Italy. So it was a pretty serious group, and so it would kind of make a little bit of sense if Letitia was actually on the left side, if she was on the anti-fascist side, which is why she was a member of that group. It would make sense perhaps why she would join this far-right group in order to use her skills as a detective in order to, play the role of Snape and report to the authorities a bunch of the plans and stuff that this far-right group was doing. And then, of course, shortly after this, she boarded this train in first class on an empty carriage and then was found dead 60 seconds later with no one either entering or leaving that carriage. And it should be noted that there was a member of La Cagoule, the far-right revolutionary group, who did actually say to the police that they knew Letitia was, a double agent, and they found that out, and so they needed to kill her. And so for weeks they were basically tracking her every move. They found out who she was meeting, where she was going, and then he said they notified a man named Jean Filiol, who was basically the assassin, the main killer for La Cagoule. This member said that Jean followed her onto the train. Nobody saw him. He stabbed her a single time in the neck and then again left before anyone could see. And this would all kind of make sense. It seemed like a very professional killing. The killing itself was swift. It was one stab to the neck. The knife itself was actually left at the scene, which also points to it being a professional hit, because if you're just a normal person with, a knife, you attack someone, you would probably think, I can't leave the knife there. It's evidence, they'll trace it back to me. Whereas if you're a professional hitman, you would probably use a weapon that you knew couldn't be traced to you. You would know not to leave any evidence, any fingerprints. And so I think you would be more comfortable leaving a weapon like this at the scene. And then this political member, the one who said that Jean Filiol did it, he later retracted his statement. And then World War II happened. The investigation just kind of got swept under the rug, and Filiol, that same year, he fled Paris, he went to Spain, he fought in a revolutionary war, to overthrow the Spanish government, and then in 1941 he returned to France, he joined Germany, he joined these bloody guys because of course he did. And then after this, he was convicted for many murders, just not Letitia's in particular. He was convicted for these crimes. He fled to Spain. And then despite many extradition requests from France, Spain never deported him. And he died sometime in the 1950s from natural causes. So a very strange, almost movie-like case. It's almost like something out of James Bond. It's got spies, undercover agents, dangerous activist political groups, and sadly one fairly young, fairly intelligent, hardworking woman who I think just got a little too deep, bit off a little more than she could chew, and this sadly seemingly cost her her life. Langville is a bit of a strange one, and this is a town in Montana that apparently completely vanished from the earth, along with all records and memory of it. The legend goes that the residents of Langville were, for whatever reason, turned inside out, and then as a government cover-up, for some reason, somehow, the town was deleted from the face of the earth, and all records, maps, history, as well as some memories of it, were completely erased in a seemingly Men in Black or SCP style event. It is a little strange in that it suffers from something called the Mandela effect, which you've probably already heard of, but it's stuff like how a lot of people remember the Monopoly Man as having a monocle, which he just doesn't wear a monocle and he never has. Or like how Darth Vader said, "Luke, I am your father," but in reality he actually said, "No, I am your father." Or like how a lot of people remember Pikachu's tail as having like a black tip on it, which it never did. So it's all these like strange common details that a lot of people remember happening or remember being true. And so because so many people swear that that's how it was, or I swear when I was a kid this is how it was, you know, like the entire world is trying to gaslight you. Because of this, a lot of people have come up with theories about alternate realities, or about time travel, or about, you know, Men in Black style stuff. And so this little town of Langville is said to suffer from the same sort of thing, in that local people remember, like vaguely when they were kids, they remember talk about, you know, this Langville existing, this local little town, and they swear they remember seeing the name, you know, printed on things, or remember hearing of people from Langville. But when we look it up today, it doesn't exist. It seemingly never existed. But as far as the truth behind this one, we may perhaps never find out. Larry Chisholm. Now, before we get into this entry, just holy cow, look at all of this guy's aliases. Like, that's a lot of different names. But Larry Chisholm, or Chisholm, was a law student in Arkansas in the 1970s. And just casually, you know, in between classes, in between lessons, he ran and organized a substance smuggling and dealing ring with a few of his fellow students and made a little chunk of money by so doing. They would basically go down to Mexico, they would smuggle large amounts of substances, and they would bring them obviously over the border and then sell them for a fair amount of profit. But in 1974, he was found out, he was picked up, arrested, charged for, as well as narcotics charges, also armed robbery, and he was sentenced to 40 years in prison. And this is where things start to get interesting. While he was in prison, he seemed to be a fairly good inmate. You know, he was always on time, he was polite, he kept up his duties and his job, you know, never made trouble for himself. But all the while he was in prison, he was, unbeknownst to the prison guards, unbeknownst to the warden, actually planning his escape. And it was 4 years later when he and a few prison inmates, they were on an outing into a bowling alley, which I didn't even know that was a thing, for prisoners to go on day trips to bowling alleys. But while he was there, Larry said he needed to use the bathroom. The guards let him go in there. Then after a while, they started to get suspicious. So one of the guards then followed him in, and he came face to face with Larry wielding a shotgun. As this was basically all part of the plan, Larry had one of his friends on the outside plant this shotgun in, like, you know, the roof, the ceiling space of the bathroom. And so this guard came in, he saw him with a shotgun, he tried to fire at Larry. Larry got a shot off on the guard, and the guard was seriously wounded, with Larry only being shot once in the hand. So Larry basically left the bowling alley with all of his inmates. They took hostage one of the people working at the bowling alley, and then they left the area, they got into a stolen vehicle, and they basically fled the scene. Then there was no trace of him whatsoever until around a month later, when Larry just walks into a bank posing as a US Treasury officer, and then points a gun at them, demands $200,000 in cash, receives the cash, and then walks off. And at this point, they don't know where he's gone, they don't know where he is, they don't know what aliases he might be using, so he basically got away with it. And so over the years, they kind of track where Larry was. You know, either they know where he is, they go there to catch him, and then he's just not there anymore, or they find evidence of somewhere he was, some identity he was using several years ago. So basically, after the bank robbery, they traced him to a place in New Orleans, and he was basically just doing like manual labor jobs down there. He was living with his girlfriend at the time. But then when they went down there to, you know, approach him, he had already disappeared. Then a year after this, they traced him to a place in Alabama, and he was, living down there again, living with a woman, but he did manage to escape before they captured him again. Then they traced him based on a tip in 1990 to a place in North Carolina, but once again, by the time police got there, he was nowhere to be seen. They did, however, find evidence of, multiple identities of him. So he was, for example, living at the time under the name Kenneth Brookins. They also found books there on how to change your identity, how to change your appearance. They found a laminating machine, perhaps for forging fake identities. And while he is currently on the US Marshals top wanted list, he hasn't been reliably tracked or seen or anything like that since 1990. The Las Cruces Bowling Alley Massacre is a very dark one, so you have been warned in advance. And this all started on a February morning in 1990 when Stephanie C. Senak, who managed this bowling alley, was just sitting in her office preparing for the day, and also with her was her 12-year-old daughter Melissa, as well as Melissa's 13-year-old friend Amy Hauser. And the pair were in there that morning with Melissa's mother because they were planning on supervising the bowling alley's daycare later that afternoon. And then at around that time, two men came in through the unlocked door in the kitchen as the bowling alley's chef, 33-year-old Ida Holguin, was in the kitchen preparing for the day. The two men had guns on them. They forced Ida into Stephanie's office, and so in the office now were Ida and Stephanie and her daughter Melissa and Melissa's friend Amy. They then told everyone to lie down on the floor. They ransacked the entire office, stole $4,000 to $5,000 worth, and while they were in there, while they were taking the money, another worker, 26-year-old Stephen Terran, arrived at the bowling alley. He didn't see anyone around, so he thought that maybe Stephanie would be in her office. And so he made his way over to the office, accompanied by his two daughters, 2-year-old Valerie and Paula, who was just 6 years old. And it was at this point when Steve entered the office that these two men decided to basically shoot everyone inside the office. All 7 people, some of them multiple times, and then set fire to the office and the bowling alley and flee the scene. The fire was reported at 8:33 in the morning, but emergency services were able to respond a lot faster because despite being shot 5 times, 12-year-old Melissa was able to get up, go over to the phone in the office, and actually call for medical services, for the police, which honestly, what a brave and strong kid she must have been. The first responders came to find that 13-year-old Amy and 6-year-old Paula and 26-year-old Stephen were all dead at the scene. 2-year-old Valerie was alive and was quickly rushed to hospital, but was pronounced dead on arrival. And 12-year-old Melissa, despite, as I said, being shot 5 times, not only didn't die, but because of her quick acting, her quick thinking, she managed to save both her mother's life, Ida the cook's life, due to them receiving medical attention as soon as possible. And as I said, it was a absolutely brutal attack. It was a needless attack. They could have just, held Stephen and his children at gunpoint and then made off with all of the money. But they decided to shoot everyone, kids, a 2-year-old, a 6-year-old, and an investigation was immediately started. They set up roadblocks, they stopped cars, they investigated people, they searched the local areas for anything, dodgy or untoward, but nothing turned up, no further evidence turned up, there were no suspects, no one charged for these crimes, and so, sadly, to this day, this case still remains unsolved. Lauren Jackson was a 5-year-old kid who went missing in Pennsylvania in 1988, and Lauren was the daughter of mother Christina O'Donnell and of father Michael Jackson. Not the Michael Jackson, obviously. But Lauren's family life wasn't that great. Her mum was a bit of a dodgy character, and this led to Lauren's dad, Michael, eventually planning to basically take Lauren and receive sole custody of her. Michael told Lauren this, but apparently didn't tell Christina. But this all takes us to a day in October in 1988, which was an otherwise perfectly normal day. Christina took her other 12-year-old daughter, Diana, out for dinner, and when they got home, Diana went off to babysit some other children in the apartment complex, while Lauren, the 5-year-old daughter, went outside to play with another kid, Brian, who, lived a few doors down. And according to Christina, she said, yeah, you can go out, you can play with Brian. I'm gonna go in for a bit, do some errands. At one point she was, sweeping on the porch, that sort of thing. And she said from her perspective, she stood out there for a little while, she watched Lauren and Brian play, then she went inside, she did some stuff, and then when she came out around 15 or 20 minutes later, both Lauren and Brian were nowhere to be seen. So she went next door to Brian's house, and she later learned that Brian and his family had kind of gone out to town, and so before they went out to town, they told Lauren to go back home. And this seems to be the case, as there are some eyewitnesses that say they saw Lauren either playing out on her own, or they saw her kind of walking back towards her home, maybe playing out on her own on her porch. But according to Christina, Lauren never came home. She searched the entire house and then soon started to search the rest of the complex, but Lauren was nowhere to be seen. So she ended up calling the police eventually. They did a massive search of the immediate area, and they took a bunch of eyewitness reports, and it really was a huge search. They used officers, firemen, friends, family, local people, helicopters, dogs, and eventually they picked up her scent and they picked up a footprint which pointed to her either having been taken or leaving voluntarily for some reason and ending up around a mile from the apartment complex in or near the Vincent Motel on Route 724. Then there was another tip by a young girl saying that she saw someone who matched Lauren's description being thrown into a car by a unidentified man, and then that man driving away. And that's kind of as far as the case went. There was another eyewitness report that said that they saw someone who maybe matched Lauren's description and maybe matched Christina's description, and she said that Christina had thrown this girl, Lauren, into a car, and then whoever else was in the car, they drove away, kind of implying that Christina had sold Lauren to someone. But the time frame on this report was kind of inconsistent, as in she was like adamant that this took place at around like 7 o'clock or precisely at 7 o'clock, whereas there were multiple other eyewitnesses that said that they saw Lauren actually playing outside of her house as late as 7:15. So Lauren couldn't have been the girl that this woman saw. Christina obviously became kind of a prime suspect, especially when the father Michael said that she would do something like this, and she hated her family and she didn't want the responsibility of looking after her children. And also he said maybe when she found out that Michael, was planning on getting full custody of her, maybe this kind of, angered her, and she thought, if I can't have Lauren, then nobody will. But despite all of this, Christina has never been charged, and sadly, Lauren has not been seen since that day. Leo Whitaker was a very strange but mundane case, and that was of a man named Leo Whitaker, who was an 86-year-old retiree. He was formerly a farmer from North Dakota, and he was at the time on a Christian missionary volunteer trip sort of thing down to Costa Rica. And while they were down there, the volunteers would help, paint churches, paint schools, which is honestly a fantastic thing for an 86-year-old to be doing. But at the time, he was with his wife at these hot springs, and while she went into the hot springs around 15 feet away, she left Leo sitting on a bench because he said he was kind of tired, he wanted to rest for a while, he didn't want to come with her into these hot springs. And she was like, okay, cool. She went into the hot springs, and when she came out around 15 minutes later, Leo was nowhere to be seen. The last time he was officially seen was by some local security guards who said that they saw Leo basically, get up off the bench, walk down this road, and they didn't think to stop him. Like, you don't just stop random people on the street. There were also other hot springs kind of up and down this road, so they said that it was fairly normal for people, for tourists to, you know, walk up and down it. But that was the last official sighting of Leo. There were some other kind of vague sightings of him around different areas in Costa Rica, and it should be noted that he didn't speak Spanish. He had obviously difficulty hearing, being 86 years old, and so maybe, perhaps it seems the most likely thing is he just got confused, disoriented, he walked off in the heat, and then I don't know, either he lost his way or he fell over somewhere. It seems strange that he was never kind of identified or reported or anything like that. But this was all in 2001, so if he is still floating around out there, he would be around 110 years old. But that is the disappearance of Leo Whitaker. The Louisiana Phantom Whistler is a bit of a strange one, a bit of a local kind of creepy mystery. And this took place in the 1950s in LA, where 18-year-old Jacqueline Cadau basically reported that she was being stalked by someone. And she didn't know who they were, she didn't really know what they wanted, but she said that they were outside of her home and they were just like whistling menacingly. She would hear these, you know, which, I don't know, might have been a bird or something, but she would apparently hear these whistles most nights outside of her home, and nothing really much changed until she announced that she was marrying a local lad named Belsom. And it was after she announced this that these whistles started to change in tune, started to become like a funeral tune, you know, very dark, very macabre. And as well as the whistles, there would be like these random screams, these random zombie moans, and Jacqueline heard them, her mother and the rest of her family heard them, and some of the neighbors heard these whistles and strange noises, but they could never locate them. Then this whistler started to whistle outside of Jacqueline's workplace, and on a few occasions he would call her and say that he would kill her if she married Belsom. Then she went one day over to Belsom's house to, you know, stay over there, and while she was there, her mother received a phone call saying that Jacqueline can't hide from him, and he knows exactly where she is. He knows that she's at Belsom's house, and once again that she had better not marry him. And then eventually she did marry Belsom, and this whistler was never heard from again. So who this was, whether this was just a local myth or legend, but if it was real, why they were harassing Jacqueline, what they actually wanted, is to this day a complete mystery. And I will butcher this Japanese pronunciation, so please let me know if you do speak Japanese how to correctly say it in the comments below. I would love to hear it. But I'm gonna go with Maruhi Geki Ukiue Senichiya. But this was an anime film released in the 1970s, or specifically in 1970, and it was actually the first ever anime film to receive an 18 rating, meaning that it was borderline hentai. The plot was a bit odd. It was set in the Edo period in Japan, so like the 16 to 1800s, and this artist in the film is asked to make an erotic painting for a client, and he agrees. He paints a sensual painting of some of his neighbors having an affair, and then the painting comes alive. It starts killing people, but that is besides the point. That is like a crazy plot. But this film ran for 10 days in theater before it was eventually taken down, even though it was then released in the 70s and 80s for like home video, you know, for cassettes and VHS. No copies of it remain to this day, and as far as we know, there are only these, you know, few images of the film, as well as a few promotional posters for the theater release. Megatherium sightings are sightings of extinct giant ground sloths. These mothers. And we do have fossil records for these dudes existing, and it was likely around like 8,000 years ago, with some being as recent as like 1,500 years ago. And it's honestly pretty cool. They were very gnarly creatures. They are sloths, which are by default pretty cool, but they were also giant, which I think giant just makes everything like much cooler. And we also have this ancient cave art and paintings, which some people think actually depict these giant ground sloths. They are now sadly all extinct, unless you believe this mystery of their sightings, as there are reports of them being seen all across America, you know, in Argentina, in Peru, Ecuador, and of course in Central and North America. My favorite version and flavor of these creatures will always be the aquatic sloths, pictured here, but that is a topic for another day, although you should definitely look them up if you want a new favorite creature. The Memphis Rap Sigils is a bit of a strange one, a bit of a peculiar one, so I won't spend too long on it, but basically this refers to the rap scene in Memphis in the 1990s, which is quite specific, I know, but this rumor, this myth, this mystery refers to these 8 rap tapes recorded in Memphis in the 1990s. And this was a time of great violence, of, you know, some of the tapes being a little bit spooky, talking about ghosts and possessions and murders, that sort of thing. But apparently these 8 rap tapes contain within the tapes these captured souls from some murder victims. And so if you listen to these tapes, they're like super spooky, they're a bit eerie, they have these souls kind of baked into them. And as I said, I will keep this one short. We won't go much more into it than that, because the evidence for this is a little vague. It's a little like, you know, 4chan-y kind of rumor myth sort of realm. But yeah, if you want to go check the records out for yourself, they are like, you know, collector's editions. If you ever find the physical records, they're worth sometimes a few $100s, and the music is sometimes quite violent, a little spooky, and maybe, if you believe it, does contain these captured lost souls of these various murder victims. And that is all we have time for. It is absolutely boiling in this room. I don't even want to find out what temperature it is in here, as the door is shut, the curtain is closed, and the sun has been beating onto this curtain for the last like 12 hours on one of the hottest days in England this year. So it is like a bloody oven in here. And I know it's been a while in between uploads. I feel like I always say this, but I will try my darndest to get back to a somewhat regular schedule. I hope you are having a lovely day, enjoying the summer, if it's summer where you are, or the winter, which I dearly miss at the moment. But wherever you are, whatever you're doing, I hope you're having a lovely day, and as always, thanks for watching.